Where better to begin than with a groundbreaking female historian? Marija Gimbutas wrote, quote, "The primordial deity for our Paleolithic and Neolithic ancestors was female, reflecting the sovereignty of motherhood. In fact, there are no images that have been found of a father god throughout the prehistoric record. Paleolithic and Neolithic symbols and images cluster around a self-generating goddess and her basic functions as giver of life, wielder of death, and as regeneratrix." Marija Gimbutas was born in 1921 in Vilnius, Lithuania. She fled her homeland during World War II when it was occupied and annexed by the Soviet Union. In 1946, she earned a PhD in archaeology at Tübingen University in Germany. Her background was interdisciplinary and included a thorough grounding in linguistics, ethnology, and the history of religions, which was unusual for an archaeologist. In 1949, she moved to the United States, where she would remain until her death 4 decades later. With her extensive knowledge of European languages, Marija Gimbutas was employed by Harvard University in 1950. She was assigned the task of conducting research and writing texts regarding European prehistory. Gimbutas was able to read and translate the archaeological reports from Eastern Europe, which opened the American to new ideas on archaeology. She remained at Harvard for 13 years, where she also became a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. In 1955, Marija Gimbutas was made a Fellow of Harvard's Peabody Museum. 1956 brought an international conference in Philadelphia, and it was here that Marija introduced her Kurgan hypothesis, which combined archaeological study of the distinctive Kurgan burial mounds with linguistics to unravel some problems in the study of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, namely to account for their origin and to trace their migrations into Europe. The word Kurgan is a Russian word from Turkic, describing the kind of graves and grave barrows built by the people of this culture. In 1963, she was invited to teach at the University of California in Los Angeles, where she remained a professor until her retirement in 1989. In Southern California, she taught Baltic and Slavic studies. She was appointed chair of European archaeology. She established the Institute of Archaeology and stimulated the development of Indo-European studies. She was the curator of Old World archaeology at the Cultural History Museum. She edited scholarly archaeology-related publications and as well as her own published works while traveling and lecturing extensively throughout the world. Gimbutas was co-founder of the Journal of Indo-European Studies. She contributed to Lithuanian journals and encyclopedias. She was always an important figure in Baltic studies. She earned a reputation as a world-class specialist on the Indo-European Bronze Age as well as on the Lithuanian folk art and the prehistory of the Balts and Slavs, partly summed up in the definitive Bronze Age cultures of Central and Eastern Europe from 1965. Gimbutas's archaeomythology scientifically analyzes the material database for Old Europe. It draws possible and probable inferences from these analyses to reconstruct the symbolic religious ideology of Old Europe. Her work resulted in the publication of The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, written while she was in residence in Holland as a fellow of the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences in 1973 and 1974. After years of solitary research, the main themes of Old European art and religion were presented in The Language of the Goddess in 1989. Her final book, The Civilization of the Goddess in 1991, presented an overview of her theories about Neolithic cultures across Europe, housing patterns, social structure, art, religion, and the nature of literacy. The book advanced what she saw as the differences between the old European system, which she considered goddess-centered and matriarchal, and the Bronze Age Indo-European patriarchal cultural elements. According to her speculation, both systems fused to form the classical European societies. In June of 1993, Marija Gimbutas received an honorary doctorate at Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas, Lithuania. The enormous appreciation she received from the scholars, students, and countless Lithuanian citizens was repeated in America the following year when Marija Gimbutas died in Los Angeles on February 2nd, 1994. Thousands of people came to express their love and respect for this great woman and Lithuanian scholar. Her discoveries took on great symbolic importance for feminists across varied disciplines who found in her vision of a peaceful, egalitarian, nature-revering society a sense of hope for the future, based on this foundation in the distant past. Unintended to her, Marija Gimbutas' impact was so great that it reached beyond the scholarly community and helped fuel the women's movement in society at large. Though scholars on methodological and ideological grounds have challenged her work, this very work fueled the initial tangible scientific and material support for the hypotheses that cultures existed wherein patriarchy did not rule, war and violence was not assumed as a cultural norm, and that there were, in fact, egalitarian social structures. Hojo Misako was born in the year 1157 AD, just over 100 years after the genesis of the Japanese samurai tradition. She married Minamoto Yorimoto, the first shogun of what was, at the time, a newly united Japan. She assumed power after his death in 1199. Hojo Misako is famous in Japanese history as the Nun Shogun. She quickly maneuvered her own family, the Hojo clan, into a regency over her son, Yorie. In keeping with customs of the time, Hojo Misako became a Buddhist nun upon the death of her husband. After Yorimoto's death, Hojo Misako, along with her father and son, usurped the real ruling power from her dead husband's ruling Minamoto clan to her own Hojo clan. Her efforts gave the Hojo clan true power over the now puppet regime Minamoto clan in the Kamakura period of 1192 through 1219. In her old age, it was she who galvanized the shogunate army which crushed the forces of the Emperor Go-Toba in 1221. The Hojos remained as regents over all the successive Minamoto shoguns for the next century and a half. For this reason, Hojo Misako became known as both Nun Shogun and Mother Shogun, and has been referred to as the founder of the shogunate. In this early feudal period, samurai women were expected to exhibit loyalty, bravery, and take on the duty of revenge. Sometimes women joined men in battle, actually fighting alongside them or encouraging the troops. And like their husbands, women were expected to commit suicide if the family was dishonored in any way. Some women used suicide as a form of protest against injustice. In wartime, women sometimes had to defend their homes. Trained in weaponry, women carried a dagger in their sleeves or sashes and could throw with deadly aim. The naginata, a long curved sword, was considered the weapon most suitable for women. Japanese girls today continue the ancient art of naginata jutsu as they learn how to wield the naginata. Edmonia Lewis was the first African-American artist to earn international fame for her artwork. Born Mary Edmonia Lewis in 1844 in New York State, Edmonia was actually African-American and Native American. Her mother was of Mississauga, Ojibwe, and African descent, while her father was Haitian of, obviously, African descent. Orphaned before she was 5, Lewis lived with her mother's nomadic tribe until she was 12 years old. Lewis's older brother, Sunrise, left the Chippewas and moved to California, where he became a gold miner. He financed his sister's early schooling in Albany, and also helped her to attend Oberlin College in Ohio in 1859. While at Oberlin, she shed her Chippewa name, Wildfire, and took the name Mary Edmonia Lewis. Her career at Oberlin ended abruptly when she was accused of poisoning 2 of her white roommates. Lewis was acquitted of the charge, though she had to endure not only a highly publicized trial, but also a severe beating by white vigilantes. Subsequently accused of stealing art supplies, she was not permitted to graduate from Oberlin. Lewis left Oberlin in 1863 and again, through her brother's encouragement and financial assistance, moved to Boston. There she met the portrait sculptor Edward Brackett, under whose direction she began her limited sculptural studies. She was determined to become a sculptor. With a minimum of training, exposure, and experience, Lewis began producing medallion portraits of well-known abolitionists, such as William Lloyd Garrison, Charles Sumner, and Wendell Phillips. With sales of her portrait busts of abolitionist John Brown and Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the Boston hero and white leader of the celebrated all-African-American 54th Regiment of the Civil War, Lewis was able to finance her first trip to Europe in 1865. After traveling to London, Paris, and Florence, Lewis decided to settle in Rome, where she rented a studio near the Piazza Barberini during the winter of 1865 and 1866. When Lewis arrived in Rome, sculptors favored the neoclassical style that was marked by a lofty idealism and Greco-Roman resources. She quickly learned Italian and became acquainted with 2 prominent white Americans living in Rome, the actress Charlotte Cushman and the sculptor Harriet Hosmer. A number of other American sculptors lived in Rome at this time because of the availability of fine white marble and the many Italian stone carvers who were adept at transferring a sculptor's plaster models into finished marble products. Lewis was unique among sculptors of her generation in Rome, as she rarely employed Italian workmen and completed most of her work without assistance. Her motivation was probably twofold: lack of money and fear of the loss of originality in her work. Unfortunately, most of Lewis's sculptures have not survived. Portrait busts of abolitionists and patrons such as Anna Quincy Waterston, and subjects depicting her dual African-American and Native American ancestry were her specialty. Lewis also completed several mythological subjects, or fancy pieces, such as Asleep, Awake, and Poor Cupid, and at least 3 religious subjects, including a lost Adoration of the Magi of 1883, and copies of Italian Renaissance sculpture. Her Moses, copied after Michelangelo, is an example of Lewis's imitative talents. The sensitively carved Hagar, also known as Hagar in the Wilderness, is probably the masterpiece among her known surviving works. In the Old Testament, Hagar, Egyptian maidservant to Abraham's wife Sarah, was the mother of Abraham's first son Ishmael. The jealous Sarah cast Hagar into the wilderness after the birth of Sarah's son, Isaac. In Lewis's sculpture, Egypt represents Black Africa, and Hagar is a symbol of courage and the mother of a long line of African kings. That Lewis depicted ethnic and humanitarian subject matter greatly distinguished her from other neoclassical sculptors. Newspaper accounts reveal that Lewis returned to the United States in 1872 to attend an exhibition of her works at the San Francisco Art Association. The San Francisco Pacific Appeal reported that Lewis was in the United States again in October 1875 and made a brief appearance at a concert held in St. Paul, Minnesota. After 1875, facts concerning the remainder of her life as well as the date and place of death are obscure and conflicting. She never married, had no children, and was last reported living in Rome in 1911. Edmonia Lewis greatly admired the poetry of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and was especially attracted to his epic poem, The Song of Hiawatha. Lewis completed at least 3 figural groups inspired by this poem: the wooing of Hiawatha, the marriage of Hiawatha and Minnehaha, and the departure of Hiawatha and Minnehaha. While in Rome in 1869, Longfellow visited Lewis's studio where he sat for a portrait and probably saw the sculptures his poem inspired. Until recently, the only surviving known work from Lewis's Hiawatha and Minnehaha series was a pair of small busts of the young lovers, which were probably studies for the figurative groups. In 1991, however, Lewis's marriage of Hiawatha and Minnehaha was rediscovered. Edmonia Lewis achieved fame and earned a living from her art in a time of virulent prejudice against minorities and women. She challenged racist preconceptions with her marble sculptures of abolitionist heroes such as Colonel Shaw, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Horace Greeley. Outspoken and bold, Edmonia worked hard for her fame. Her work became famous and popular worldwide, selling for large sums of money, and she was commissioned for many portraits by famous people including U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. Her statue, The Death of Cleopatra, drew thousands of viewers in exhibition. Edmonia's success and fame continue to inspire generations of artists. Perhaps her own words best express her life's work and play. Tahiri was a Persian activist, intellectual, princess, and poetess, deserving of remembrance throughout the world. Fatima Barakani, born in Qazvin, Iran, is better known by her honorific titles Tahiri, the Pure One, and Kurat al-Ain, Solace of the Eyes. Her activism, intellectual struggles, tragic life story, and execution has captivated generations of modern Iranians, making her an icon in the struggle for women's emancipation and rights. In the Babi and Baha'i faiths, she's venerated as a martyr. Tahiri, born into a wealthy and powerful family, was educated by her father in theology, jurisprudence, Persian literature, and philosophy. Her interest in jurisprudence attracted her to the Shaki and Babi religious movements. After a Babi gathering at which she publicly unveiled herself, she was arrested for heresy. The unveiling caused a great deal of controversy, and the Bab named her Tahiri, meaning the Pure One, to show his support for her. She was soon arrested and placed under house arrest in Tehran. A few years later, in mid-1852, she was executed in secret on account of her Babi faith. As a prominent Babi, she was the 17th disciple or letter of the living of the Bab. She is highly regarded by Baha'is and often mentioned in Baha'i literature as an example of courage in the struggle for women's rights. Her date of birth is uncertain, as birth records were destroyed at her execution. About 20 poems attributed to her have become symbols of activism in Iran. Here follows one of her poems, given here now to express the timeless resonance which can be thoroughly understood and felt today. It is written from an imagined future perspective of worldwide harmony and wisdom acquired. The Morn of Guidance by Tahiri. Truly, the morn of guidance commands the breeze to begin. All the world has been illuminated, every horizon, every people. No more sits the sheikh in the seat of hypocrisy. No more becomes the mosque a shop dispensing holiness. The tie of the turban will be cut at its source. No sheikh will remain, neither glitter nor secrecy. The world will be free from superstition and vain imaginings, the people free from deception and temptation. Tyranny is destined for the arm of justice. Ignorance will be defeated by perception. The carpet of justice will be outspread to everywhere, and the seeds of friendship and unity will be spread throughout. The false commands eradicated from the earth, the principle of opposition changed to that of unity. Boudicca was the Celtic queen of the Iceni tribe of modern-day East Anglia, Britain, who led a revolt against Rome in the years 60 through 61 CE. The Iceni king Prasutagus, an independent ally of Rome, divided his estate between his daughters and King Nero of Rome. When Prasutagus died, however, his lands were taken by Rome, and the Iceni lost their status as allies. His wife Boudicca objected to this action, to say the least, and here follows the story of the subsequent events for which she is best known. The Romanization and/or Europeanization of Britain caused uprisings throughout the country, which the Romans speedily quelled one by one. But the insult that enraged the nation and incited the Britons to rise up in nationwide rebellion was the public flogging of the queen on the orders of the Roman procurator Caius Decianus, and the rape of her two teenage daughters by Roman soldiers. The Britons rallied to their queen from every part of the country. Queen Boudicca collected 120,000 volunteers, which increased to 230,000, and set out on a war of liberation to expel the Roman occupiers. The Britons attacked the Roman troops in Britain and their widely scattered outposts, captured Roman forts, and massacred Roman colonists in their settlements. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, hurried back to London with only his cavalry and left his main force still on the march. He soon realized that he could not defend the city, and he abandoned the capital and moved north to join the main body of his troops. Queen Boudicca defeated the Romans in a series of battles, one of which she defeated Petilius Cerealis, who lost all of his infantry and had to retreat with his cavalry into his fortified camp. Queen Boudicca retook London, Colchester, and St. Albans, which had become the three main centers for Roman life. The great temple the Romans had just finished building at Colchester, dedicated to emperor worship, which the Britons regarded as symbolic of their oppression, was destroyed by Queen Boudicca. Caius Decianus, the Roman procurator, fled to the European continent, taking with him as much of the British treasury as he could carry. His report to the Roman Emperor Nero, explaining his panic-stricken arrival in Gaul, led the emperor to believe that Britain was irretrievably lost, and the news of Boudicca's successes caused the Roman Emperor Nero to consider abandoning Britain altogether. Meantime, Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, was about collecting Roman troops in Britain, awaiting reinforcements from the European continent, before directly engaging the British Queen. Britain was almost lost to the Roman Empire. However, Suetonius Paulinus, the hero of campaigns in Germany, Africa, and Parthia, secured the empire's hold on Britain by his decisive victory over Queen Boudicca. Year AD 61, in battle at Manchester in Warwickshire, Queen Boudicca commanded the British army in person. Tacitus, the Roman writer, wrote of Boudicca riding in her chariot with her two daughters, driven by a charioteer, inspecting her army before the battle. The Britons outnumbered the Romans by 10-1. However, the lack of organization among the British militiamen was no match for the hardened discipline of the Roman soldiers, and after a day of intense fighting, the Britons were defeated, routed, and scattered in all directions. This victory finally established the Roman presence in Britain. Queen Boudicca, seeing that all was lost, took flight back to her castle, which was soon besieged by the Romans under Paulinus. Queen Boudicca, in despair, and aware that Paulinus planned to carry her captive in a cage and drag her in chains naked in a triumphal parade through the streets of Rome, committed suicide. She drank poison. It must have been an eerie sight for Paulinus and his soldiers on entering the throne room after storming the castle to find the queen dressed in full regalia, dead and seated upon the British throne. The classic Dio Cassius says that Queen Boudicca was given a royal funeral by the Britons, who buried her in a costly tomb which was built especially for her. Her gravesite today is unknown. There has been some speculation that it lies under Platform 10 at King's Cross Station, while others conjecture that it lies under a mound in Parliament Hill Fields in Hampstead. Then, yet another suggestion is that it is buried under the earthwork at Amesbury Banks in Epping Forest. Queen Boudicca is remembered in history as a great patriotic queen and freedom fighter who died defending her country against foreign conquerors. Her story forms the theme for the play Boudicca by John Fletcher in 1618, and a literary ballad by William Cooper, Boudicca, an Ode, from 1782, and of Tennyson's poem Boudicca from 1865. There is today a statue of her in her chariot on the embankment of the Thames at Westminster Palace, where Parliament meets. Her two daughters were both married off by the Romans, one to the British Prince Marius, and the other was given in marriage to the Irish king Ferdoc, also known as Fecnoch. Marija Montessori was an Italian physician, educator, and innovator, acclaimed for her educational method that builds on the way children naturally learn. She opened the first Montessori school, the Casa dei Bambini, or Children's House, in Rome on January 6, 1907. Subsequently, she traveled the world and wrote extensively about her approach to education, attracting many devotees. There are now more than 22,000 Montessori schools in at least 110 countries worldwide. Marija Montessori was born on August 31, 1870, in the provincial town of Chiaraval, Italy. Her father was a financial manager for a state-run industry. Her mother was raised in a family that prized education. She was well-schooled and an avid reader, unusual for Italian women of the time. The same thirst for knowledge took root in young Marija, and she immersed herself in many fields of study before creating the educational method that bears her name. Beginning in her early childhood years, Marija grew up in Rome, a paradise of libraries, museums, and fine schools. Marija was a sterling student, confident, ambitious, and unwilling to be limited by traditional expectations for women. At age 13, she entered an all-boys technical institute to prepare for a career in engineering. In time, however, she changed her mind, deciding to become a doctor instead. She applied to the University of Rome's medical program, but was rejected. Marija took additional courses to better prepare her for entrance to the medical school and persevered. With great effort, she gained admittance, opening the door a bit wider for future women in the field. When she graduated from medical school in 1896, she was among Italy's first female physicians. Marija's early medical practice focused on psychiatry. She also developed an interest in education, attending classes on pedagogy and immersing herself in educational theory. Her studies led her to observe and call into question the prevailing methods of teaching children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The opportunity to improve on these methods came in 1900 when she was appointed co-director of a new training institute for special education teachers. Marija approached the task scientifically, carefully observing and experimenting to learn which teaching methods worked best. Many of the children made unexpected gains, and the program was proclaimed a success. In 1907, Marija accepted a new challenge to open a child care center in a poor inner-city district. This became the first Casa dei Bambini, a quality learning environment for young children. The youngsters were unruly at first, but soon showed great interest in working with puzzles, learning to prepare meals, and manipulating materials that held lessons in math. She observed how they absorbed knowledge from their surroundings, essentially teaching themselves. Utilizing scientific observation and experience gained from her earlier work with young children, Marija designed learning materials and a classroom environment that fostered the children's natural desire to learn. News of the school's success soon spread through Italy, and by 1910, Montessori schools were acclaimed worldwide. In the years following, and for the rest of her life, Marija dedicated herself to advancing her child-centered approach to education. She lectured widely, wrote articles and books, and developed a program to prepare teachers in the Montessori method. Through her efforts and the work of her followers, Montessori education was adopted worldwide. As a public figure, Marija also campaigned vigorously on behalf of women's rights. She wrote and spoke frequently on the need for greater opportunities for women, and was recognized in Italy and beyond as a leading feminist voice. Marija Montessori pursued her ideals in turbulent times. Living through war and political upheaval inspired her to add peace education to the Montessori curriculum. But she could do little to avoid being ensnared in world events. Traveling to India in 1940 when hostilities between Italy and Great Britain broke out, she was forced to live in exile for the remainder of the war. There, she took the opportunity to train teachers in her method. At war's end, she returned to Europe, spending her final years in Amsterdam. She died peacefully in a friend's garden on May 6, 1952. Hatshepsut was only the third woman to become pharaoh in 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, and the first to attain the full power of the position. Cleopatra, who also exercised such power, would rule some 14 centuries later. A daughter of King Thutmose I, Hatshepsut became Queen of Egypt when she married her half-brother Thutmose II around the age of 12. Upon his death, she began acting as regent for her stepson, the infant Thutmose III, but later took on the full powers of a pharaoh, becoming co-ruler of Egypt around 1473 BC. As pharaoh, Hatshepsut extended Egyptian trade and oversaw ambitious building projects, most notably the Temple of Deir el-Bahri, located in western Thebes, where she would be buried. Depicted, at her own orders, as a male in many contemporary images and sculptures, Hatshepsut remained largely unknown to scholars until the 19th century. Hatshepsut was the elder of two daughters born to Thutmose I and his queen, Amis. After her father's death, 12-year-old Hatshepsut became queen of Egypt when she married her half-brother, Thutmose II, the son of her father and one of his secondary wives, who inherited his father's throne around 1492 BC. They had one daughter, Neferure. Thutmose II died young, around 1479 BC, and the throne went to his infant son, also born to a secondary wife. According to custom, Hatshepsut began acting as Thutmose III's regent, handling affairs of state until her stepson came of age. After less than 7 years, however, Hatshepsut took the unprecedented step of assuming the title and full powers of a pharaoh herself, becoming co-ruler of Egypt with Thutmose III. Though past Egyptologists held that it was merely the queen's ambition that drove her, more recent scholars have suggested that the move might have been due to a political crisis, such as a threat from another branch of the royal family, and that Hatshepsut may have been acting to save the throne for her stepson. Knowing that her power grab was highly controversial, Hatshepsut fought to defend its legitimacy, pointing to her royal lineage and claiming that her father had appointed her his successor. She sought to reinvent her image, and in statues and paintings of that time, she ordered that she be portrayed as a male pharaoh with a beard and large muscles. In other images, however, she appeared in traditional female regalia. Hatshepsut surrounded herself with supporters in key positions in government, including Senenmut, her chief minister. Some have suggested that Senenmut might also have been Hatshepsut's lover, but little evidence exists to support this claim, aside from the fact that he had a chapel and tomb constructed for himself in the tombs of the nobles and at the tomb which contains a famous star ceiling near the temple at Deir el-Bahri, near Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. As pharaoh, Hatshepsut undertook ambitious building projects, particularly in the area around Thebes. Her greatest achievement was the enormous memorial temple at Deir el-Bahri, considered one of the architectural wonders of ancient Egypt. Another great achievement of her reign was a trading expedition she authorized that brought back vast riches, including ivory, ebony, gold, leopard skins, and incense, to Egypt from a distant land known as Punt, possibly modern-day Eritrea. Hatshepsut probably died around 1458 BC, when she would have been in her mid-40s. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings, located in the hills behind Deir el-Bahri. In another effort to legitimize her reign, she had her father's sarcophagus reburied in her tomb, so they could lie together in death. Thutmose III went on to rule for 30 more years, proving to be both an ambitious builder like his stepmother and a great warrior. Late in his reign, Thutmose III had almost all of the evidence of Hatshepsut's rule, including the images of her as king on the temples and monuments she had built, eradicated, possibly to erase her example as a powerful female ruler, or to close the gap in the dynasty's line of male succession. As a consequence, scholars of ancient Egypt knew almost nothing of Hatshepsut's existence until 1822, when they were able to decode and read the hieroglyphics on the walls of Deir el-Bahri. In 1903, the British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered Hatshepsut's sarcophagus, one of 3 that she had prepared, but it was empty, like nearly all of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. After launching a new search in 2005, a team of archaeologists discovered her mummy in 2007. It is now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The intentions of Thutmose III were for posterity to be ignorant of Hatshepsut. He failed. Not only was Hatshepsut's name erased, but some of her monuments were destroyed. She built 2 obelisks of red granite, the largest built to that point. This was a continuation of the works of her father, who was not able to complete all his construction plans. Her name appeared on the obelisks, but instead of toppling them, Thutmose III ordered them sheathed in masonry. Their gilded pyramidions were probably the only original elements to be exposed. Later, one of the obelisks was destroyed after all. In all, Hatshepsut accomplished what no woman had before her. She ruled the most powerful advanced civilization in the world, successfully, for 20 years without war. Even if there were some who resented her success stands for all eternity. Nellie Cashman was one of the Old West's original female entrepreneurs, as well as a prospector and a quote-unquote angel of mercy. Wandering the frontier mining camps of the West, seeking her fortune, she was soon known throughout for her charity, courage, and determination. Ellen Nellie Cashman was born in Queenstown, County Cork, Ireland, to Patrick Cashman and Frances Fanny Cronin in 1845. Her father died when she was a very young child, when Nellie was just 5 years old. She and her sister Fanny immigrated with their mother to the United States during the potato famine. They first settled in Boston before moving to Washington, D.C. There, Nellie got her first job working as a lift operator in a hotel, where she often overheard Civil War politics. On one occasion, she even met General Ulysses S. Grant, who urged her to go west. Evidently, taking Grant's advice, the family made their way to San Francisco in 1865. Fanny soon married and began to raise a family. However, an adventurous Nellie, enamored with the gold rush stories of the West, soon hired out as a cook in various Nevada mining camps, including Virginia City and Pioche. After carefully saving her money, she opened the miners' boarding house at Panica Flat, Nevada in 1872. She was said to have always been a great friend to the miners, often feeding them and providing lodging if they had no money. Later, Cashman would be described as pretty as a Victorian cameo and, when necessary, tougher than two-penny nails. And that she was. These few Nevada mining camps would be just some of the first that Cashman would spend time in, always starting a business, doing a little prospecting on the side, and looking after the miners. In 1874, when gold was discovered in the Cassiar Mountains of British Columbia, Canada, Nellie joined up with a group of 200 Nevada miners headed northward. At Telegraph Creek, she set up another boarding house for miners. Again, she looked after the miners, providing help when they needed it and looking after them when they were ill. A devout Catholic, Nellie began collecting money for Sisters of St. Anne of Victoria to build a hospital. Appreciative of her care, they were quick to help. Sometime later, Cashman traveled to Victoria to deliver $500 in donations which would help the nuns in building St. Joseph's Hospital. While there, she heard that 26 miners had been stranded in a snowstorm back in the Cassiar Mountains. Wasting no time, she organized a rescue expedition with 6 men and a number of pack animals, carrying 1,500 pounds of supplies, and took off with the expedition to find the stranded men. Conditions in these mountains were so hazardous at that time that even the Canadian Army had refused to mount a rescue. When they heard about Cashman's expedition, the commander sent his troops to find her and return her and the men back to safety. However, when they did find her, she refused to return without the stranded miners. After 77 days, sometimes treading through as much as 10 feet of snow, she finally found the men, who turned out to number more than 75 rather than the rumored 26. Suffering from severe scurvy, she loaded them up with vitamin C in their diets and nursed them back to health. When the Cassiar strike played out, Nellie headed for the silver fields of Arizona in 1879. First settling in Tucson in 1879, she opened the Delmonico restaurant, the first business in town to be owned by a woman. Though she often gave her food away free to the hungry, her restaurant was a success. But her time in Tucson would be short-lived, as in 1880, she sold the restaurant and moved on to the new silver rush in booming town of Tombstone. Upon her arrival, she first ran a boot and shoe store briefly before opening the Russ House restaurant. According to one popular legend, when a client complained about Nellie's cooking, Doc Holliday was present. When Holliday drew his sidearm and asked the customer to repeat what he had said, the embarrassed customer replied, "Best I ever ate." She continued her work for the Catholic faith, raising money to build the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Tombstone, and worked as a nurse. Before enough money was raised to build the church, she convinced the owners of the Crystal Palace Saloon to allow Sunday church services to be held there, also raising money for the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, the Miners' Hospital, and any miner who might have fallen on hard times. She soon was called an Angel of Mercy. Once, when a group of miners attempted to lynch mine owner E.B. Gage during a labor dispute, Nellie drove her buggy right into the mob and rescued Gage, spiriting him away to Benson, Arizona. After returning from an unsuccessful gold expedition to Baja California, her widowed sister Fanny died of tuberculosis, leaving Nellie to raise her 5 children. In 1886, Nellie sold the Russ House and left Tombstone with the children. Traveling to several places in Arizona, Including Nogales, Jerome, Prescott, Yuma, and Harquahala, she again set up restaurants and worked part-time at prospecting. Later, she wandered other mining camps in Wyoming, Montana, and New Mexico. Under her care, all 5 children became successful, productive citizens, despite their constant wandering. When the Klondike Gold Rush began, Nellie headed to the Yukon in 1898. In Dawson City, she set up yet another restaurant and mercantile, again helping the miners whenever they were in need. In 1904, she went to Fairbanks, where she opened a grocery store. All the while, she was collecting claims in the region which she worked on when she could. Nellie finally settled down in Victoria, British Columbia in 1923. 2 years later, in January 1925, she died of pneumonia in the very same hospital she had helped to build, St. Joseph's. Because of her giving spirit, when she died, she was known throughout the West, and her eulogy was published in papers as far away as New York. This diminutive woman, who often dressed as a man and never married, had made her mark as one of the first women entrepreneurs in the West, as well as a miner and an angel of mercy. Throughout the various mining camps, she had variously been called the Frontier Angel, Saint of the Sourdoughs, Miner's Angel, Angel of the Caser, and the Angel of Tombstone. On March 15, 2006, Nellie Cashman was inducted into the Alaska Mining Hall of Fame. Even into old age, Nellie was still prospecting at the Arctic Circle and mushing her huskies well into her 70s. Señora Flores de Andrade, early Mexican activist, was born in the state of Chihuahua sometime in the late 19th century, where she spent her early years on the estate of her grandparents. The family was relatively well off, and the girl was given an education and encouraged in such sports as bareback horse riding. Her grandparents died when she was 13, leaving her a good inheritance. To her family's displeasure, she immediately gave absolute liberty to all the peasants who had worked on the estate and supplied them with tools and animals to continue to work the land as long as they wished. She married a man of German origin with whom she had 6 children. He died 12 years after the marriage, and she moved with her children to Chihuahua City, where she began to work with a political group known as the Daughters of Cuauhtémoc, who were involved with the Partido Liberal Mexicano. Her work with the group caused even further dissension within her family, and she became quite impoverished and ultimately moved with her children and Pedro Mendoza, a member of the party, to El Paso, Texas in 1906 in hope of improving her economic situation. There, she lived and worked with Mendoza, organizing the local Mexican community for the People's Liberation Movement. In her own words, quote, "I took charge of collecting money, clothes, medicines, and even ammunition and arms to begin to prepare for the revolutionary movement. In 1910, when all those who were relatives of those who had taken up arms were arrested by order of the Mexican federal authorities, I had to come to Ciudad Juarez. I was then put into prison, but soon was let out, and I went back to El Paso to continue the fight." Her marriage had turned out to be unhappy, and Flores ultimately separated from Mendoza, accusing him of infidelity and abuse. 3 years after her arrival in El Paso, she joined another women's group, which she also worked with Mexican revolutionaries. In addition, she allied herself with Francisco Madero, a Mexican revolutionary who later became president of Mexico. Like Mexican-born Texans Sara Estela Ramirez and Teresa and Andrea Villarreal, Flores de Andrade sought a democratic society for Mexico. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 was the most significant event in modern Mexican history, and it affected every sector and walk of life in Mexican society. It was during this time that Flores would enact her most significant role. She was an ardent member of a secret society whose aim was to overthrow Porfirio Diaz and achieve freedom for all Mexicans. To this end, she marched and petitioned so successfully that she aroused both Diaz and the U.S. officials who supported him. Hunted by both, she sought refuge in the north but was eventually captured and sentenced to death. Upon facing the firing squad, she allegedly grabbed the commander's rifle, forced his men to put down their weapons, and escaped into the U.S., but was arrested then by American authorities, only to receive a telegraph from President Taft, who ordered her release. However improbable it sounds, she did survive to tell her story. Flores has this to say about the following day, the epilogue to her own story and to that of the revolution. Quote, "And they sent me home, a Negro military band accompanying me through the streets. At the triumph of the cause of Señor Madero, we had some great festivities in Ciudad Juarez. Afterwards, Señor Madero sent for me and asked me what I wanted. I told him that I wanted the education of my 6 children, and that all the promises which had been made to the Mexican people should be carried out." End quote. Flores de Andrade's oral history, as recounted to Mexican anthropologist Manuel Gamio, has provided insights into the political activism of women among Mexican political refugees in Texas in the early 20th century. Anna Pavlovna Filosofova, born August 5, 1837, died March 17, 1912. She was a Russian philanthropist and feminist. She was an important charity organizer, and alongside Maria Trubnikova and Nadezhda Stasova, was one of the founders and leaders of the first organized Russian women's movement. Anna was born into the old Muscovite family of the Diaghilevs. At 20, she wed V.D. Filosofov, the high-ranking official who worked closely with Milutin in reforming the war ministry. The marriage was happy, and their children were numerous by the time of Anna's involvement in the struggle for women's higher education. She was drawn into organized philanthropy, along with Maria Trubnikova and Nadezhda Stasova, and together these 3 women established a clothing workshop to provide employment for needy women, as well as a women's publishing company, a cooperative enterprise that printed, bound, and sold books. In these philanthropic ventures, the triumvirate developed the skills needed to organize the women's movement in St. Petersburg. Anna Filosofova refused to allow government officials to ignore questions of women's education. Neither was she averse to badgering famous author Tolstoy at official functions and regal balls. Indeed, her aggressive advocacy of women's higher education helped label her a red in high government circles, although her propensity to blush may have contributed to this epithet. Like Zemstvo liberals and the academic intelligentsia, she and her business partners eschewed violent confrontation and tried to win concessions through personal appeals and petitioning. All 3 ladies demonstrated considerable skill in rallying popular support. For Marxism, Anna had no use and looked upon all political parties as, quote, "a herd of bison," end quote, almost indistinguishable from one another. Her expanding women's circle, which was instrumental in the establishment of the first general education courses for women in St. Petersburg in 1870 and the Bestuzev advanced courses for women in 1878. Anna headed a number of philanthropic societies after 1859. She was known for her kindness and generosity, and she was often approached for help by the families of convicted and exiled revolutionaries. Her sympathies for these revolutionaries were unpopular with Russian officials. In 1879, she was exiled abroad for giving aid to revolutionary organizations and only allowed to return in 1881. She was active in the international women's movement, becoming vice president of the International Council of Women in 1899. During the Revolution of 1905 through 1907, she sided with the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets, and opposed the participation of women in the revolutionary movement. She was chairman of the first All-Russian Women's Congress in 1908. After finding much solace in the emerging Theosophical Society which she helped create, she devoted her final years to uniting all women's clubs in Russia and affiliating them to a feminist international organization. Her last major act was presiding over Russia's own Women's Congress of 1908. When she died in 1912, she was widely honored. Sayyida al Hurra was a 16th century pirate queen, born into a wealthy Muslim family circa 1485. Though Islamic records of the time are strangely silent about her, she was a powerful force of the time and an equal ally of the famous pirate Barbarossa. Her birth name is unknown, but the title by which she was and is known, Sayyida al Hurra, means noble lady who is free and independent, the woman's sovereign who bows to no superior authority. Sayyida was from the Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim-ruled state in Spain at the end of the Reconquista, the centuries-long retaking of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. Her family fled to Morocco after the fall of Granada in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain conquered Granada, murdering or enslaving up to 100,000 Muslims and forcing another 20,000 to flee, many of which went to Constantinople. Sayyida's family was among those who escaped with their lives. The city of Tetuan in northern Morocco, which Sayyida ruled, was first settled around the 3rd century, but had been destroyed earlier in the 15th century by the Castilians. Sayyida, along with her first husband, rebuilt the city after the Reconquista refugees received permission from the Sultan of Morocco to settle and fortify the area. Following the death of her husband in 1515, Sayyida became the last person in Islamic history to legitimately hold the title of al-Hurra, meaning queen. Perhaps because of the memory of being forced to flee her home in childhood, Sayyida, like many other Muslims in the area, turned to piracy against her Christian enemy. She reached out to Barbarossa of Algiers, who controlled the eastern Mediterranean Sea, while she controlled the west and assembled her own fleet. She wreaked havoc on Spanish and Portuguese shipping lines and was the undisputed leader of the pirates in the region. She became the ruler of the western Mediterranean region, accepted basically as the boss by Muslims and Christians alike, and was the person with whom the release of Spanish and Portuguese captives had to be negotiated. She was an extremely bold and successful pirate and used all of the booty and ransom money acquired to restore and beautify Tetuan, making her very popular with the people she governed. Most information on Sayyida al Hurra comes from Spanish and Portuguese records. They were in close contact with her, negotiating the return of prisoners and playing a key role in the diplomatic game. Sayyida remarried later to the King of Morocco. To show that she had no intention of giving up her power and position, she refused to leave Tetuan for the marriage, forcing the king to come to her. This is the only time in Moroccan history that a king married away from the capital. After ruling for 30 years, Sayyida was deposed by her son-in-law in 1542. She was stripped of property and power, and her ultimate fate is unknown. A rebel against Victorian Moors, Jane Ellen Harrison became one of the first women to hold a research fellowship at Cambridge. A friend of such distinguished figures as Gilbert Murray and Francis Cornford, she was renowned for her public lectures on Greek art, for her books on Greek religion and mythology, and for her unconventional and outspoken views. She was born on September 9th, 1850, very shortly after which her mother died, and she was educated by governesses at home. And in 1868, the Ladies' College, Cheltenham, where she learned German and Greek and Latin, all by age 17. Harrison supported herself, lecturing at the British Museum and private all-boys schools and throughout the British provinces to huge popular acclaim. She incorporated sound effects and lantern slides. Nearly 1,600 people attended her Glasgow lecture on Athenian gravestones. She traveled to Italy and Germany, meeting the Prague scholar Wilhelm Klein. Klein introduced her to Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who invited her to participate in his archaeological tours in Greece. Her early book, The Odyssey in Art and Literature, a summary book without original observation, appeared in 1882. Harrison met the scholar D.S. McCall, who purportedly proposed marriage to her. Though she declined, McCall advised her against writing and lecturing in manner pandering to the public in Victorian asceticism. She suffered a severe depression, studying Greek art more objectively to, in part, cure herself, particularly reevaluating the more primitive eras of the art. Harrison's visit to McCall in Greece in 1888 left her with an interest in the cults that perpetuated Greek mythology. She concluded that the religion depicted in early Greek art was fundamentally different from the art and literature the Greeks studied in contemporary Europe. She became the central figure of the group known as the Ritualists. In 1903, her first book of truly original scholarship, Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion, appeared. In her application of anthropology to classical studies, Harrison stirred up controversy amongst her academic colleagues, while at the same time influencing many writers, including Yeats, D.H. Lawrence, and Virginia Woolf. Driven by the conviction that the study of primitive Greek culture was an intensely practical enterprise, addressing the fundamental emotional needs of all people, she set her academic research in the broader context of human life. Her work on Greek religion is really a critique of all religion. Although she was a powerful role model for academic women and addressed issues which were central to the women's movement, when it came to women's rights, her own views were not always in keeping with those of her suffragist contemporaries. Harrison wrote not to champion any cause, but out of a passionate desire to share what she believed to be important and true. In so doing, she both opened up new possibilities for academic women and made a considerable contribution to classical studies. Born in 1449, Mandukai Khatun, also known as Mandukai Seshen Khatun, was a Mongolian empress. The word Khatun is the female form of the word Khan, as in Genghis Khan. Born into a family of aristocrats, she married Manduul Khan when she was 18 years old and bore a daughter whose name, unfortunately, is not known. Soon after the death of her husband, the Khan, Manduhai adopted the 7-year-old orphan Batmunk, then the last living direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Manduhai named him Dayan Khan, meaning Great Khan, or Khan of the whole universe. When Dayan Khan turned 19, Manduhai married him, again becoming the Khatun or Empress. Older and more experienced than the Khan, she retained great influence over court and military. Together, they reunified the Mongol retainers of the former eastern region of the Mongol Empire. Manduhai fought in battles herself, even while pregnant, and was once injured while carrying twins of Dayan Khan. She and the twins survived, and her army was victorious. From 1480, Dayan Khan and Manduhai were pressured by the Ming Chinese territory because they closed the border trade and killed a Mongol envoy. To contain her, the Ming Chinese rapidly expanded the Great Wall and used the new artillery of gunpowder to defeat her troops. While ruling Mongolia, she reoccupied the Ordos area and stationed soldiers there to keep watch on China. While Dayan Khan was battling the Ming army, Eslem, Ming spy, who had been a close king's advisor for the past 30 years, led much trouble and attacked the fortress of the king, trying to kill Mandukai and the heir to the throne. Eslem was allowed in with no suspicion and opened the gates. Mandukai and the outnumbered guards fought valiantly, but were, in the end, overwhelmed by surprise. The heir to the throne, Ulazbold, was secretly taken to safety, but Mandukai died fighting Eslem in 1510. Mandukai had managed to keep Dayan Khan in power as Chinggis Khan's descendant and defeated the Oirats, actions which have contributed to the legends which formed about her life. She left 7 sons and 3 daughters. The later Khans and nobles of Mongolia are her descendants. Best known for painting what has become the most famous tarot deck, usually called the Rider-Waite Tarot, artist Pamela Colman Smith came into her own, having grown up playing an active part in the lives of other famous artists behind the scenes. She was born on February 16, 1878, in London, where her American parents lived. Her father, Charles Smith, had business in trade and law with prominent interests in art and collecting. He was related to actor William Gillette, through whom Pamela met Ellen Terry and the rest of the theater crowd with whom her life would become so intensely involved. Her mother, Corinne's family, was noted for having long been artistic and mystical, and Corinne herself was a parlor actress. Charles's work had caused many travels for the couple between America and London and Jamaica, where he had a hand in building railroads, and also where the family moved in 1889 when Pamela was 10. Here in Jamaica, she learned the folklore that was so important to her from her nurse. In 1893, they moved to Brooklyn, where she attended the Progressive Pratt Institute, where creativity was taught and encouraged as equal to the other subjects. She here came under the influence of Arthur Wesley Dow, who was himself inspired by Japanese art, and taught her that pictures could be composed the same way as music, by using color, tone, shape, and line, much more abstract than imitative drawing. That art was social and spiritual. This brought out the true Pamela. This is what she realized she had always longed to do and was all too natural with, expressing emotions visually. She painted synesthetically, using a harmony of colored spaces. Synesthesia involves the mixing of sensory signals, hearing colors, seeing sounds, smelling music or words, etc. We all have this to some degree, but Pamela became famous for her artworks inspired by music. The music paintings were directly channeled by listening to performances and drawing unconsciously. She often stated that if she paid attention to the drawing, she lost the image. Pamela did not graduate from Pratt due to her frequent illnesses, and she moved again with her family back to Jamaica. It was there her mother died in 1896. The next year, when she was 19, 4 of her watercolors sold at her first feature exhibition. The wonder year for this young lady was 1899, when she published 4 books: The Golden Vanity / Green Bed, Widdicombe Fair, and Anansi Stories. The 4th, In Chimney Corners, was written by famed Irish historian Seamus McManus, but included color plates and line drawings from Pamela. Anansi Stories was her retelling of the Jamaican folklore. She also began touring at this time with the Lyceum Company, where she and her father met John Butler Yeats, father of poet and occultist William Butler Yeats. Her work on these tours was in designing sets and costumes and led to much cultivation of personal research. From all this, Pamela developed her understanding of symbols and symbolic language, which evidenced in the tarot deck, in which each card is a complex vignette conveying a wealth of condensed values and meanings. Among the members of the Lyceum Theater Company was its business manager, the author of Dracula himself, Bram Stoker. This was his day job when he wasn't writing novels. He was popular with the cast and crew and affectionately known as Uncle Brahmi. In 1901, Pamela joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of which fellow members were William Butler Yeats, Arthur Edward Waite, and Aleister Crowley. Art and theater were experiencing an immense revival at this time as Victorian standards were slowly being washed away. She began having visions and to paint her music paintings. She really did see music and transmitted those visions into tangible works. She became increasingly popular in the next decade and had one-woman exhibitions, garnering newspaper praise. In 1909, she wrote in a letter that she was about to finish a set of drawings for a new tarot deck for very little money. It was a commission from fellow Golden Dawn member Arthur Edward Waite. Tarot decks were very rare at this time and usually imported from France and of a relatively simplistic design. Waite had conceived of the new deck and did give her some instruction, and this is how their relationship is usually recalled today, that he told her what to do and she did it. Not quite so, however. Remember, Pamela herself already was both educated in occultism and had a natural gift for letting nature essentially compose its own works through her. Some good research will show that Pamela's contribution to this deck is at least a little more from her than him. In fact, there were a few cards he asked her to paint again, this time without being so direct about their mutual society's occult secrets. Pamela expanded and expounded, as it were, the symbolic storytelling of the tarot's major arcanum, as well as offer a totally new feature to the deck, fully illustrated minor cards as well. Before this, the minors had all shown merely the number of a given suit's elemental tools, such as 5 chalices or 7 swords. She continued producing artworks, contributing regularly to the suffrage movement, and moved to Cornwall in 1918, where she ran an ultimately unsuccessful retreat house for priests. There is little to nothing known about the last 35 years of her life, including artwork beyond the year 1918. She died on September 18, 1951, in her by now long-term home of Cornwall. She was heavily in debt and all her possessions were auctioned. Her gravesite is unknown. But for a tarot deck, she too perhaps would have remained unknown. In the person of Eneduana, we are confronted by a woman who was at once a princess, priestess, poetess, a personality who set standards in all 3 of her roles by many succeeding centuries, and whose merits were recognized in singularly Mesopotamian fashion long after. Eneduana is the daughter of Sargon the Akkadian, the king who unified Central and South Mesopotamia for the first time in an empire, and founder of a dynasty that ruled the region with success for at least 150 years. Sargon himself can be considered the world's first emperor, having reigned for 55 years, from 2334 through 2279 BC. Georges Roux in ancient Iraq makes the point that Sargon was meticulous in honoring these civil and religious institutions which suited his purpose, which was hegemony over the largest area possible. Thus, to consolidate his position as the legitimate ruler over Sumer and Akkad, Sargon needed to ensure that the people believed he had been chosen by the gods as the rightful and just ruler. Sargon then appointed his daughter, the royal princess, to be En, priestess of the temple of the moon god Nana at Ur. The act of giving his first daughter and royal princess to Nana as his high priestess has extraordinary importance because Nana Suen, the moon god, is the firstborn of Enlil and Ninlil, Lord and Lady Air, the chief couple of the Mesopotamian pantheon, and one of Nana's epithets is Prince of the Gods. Nana, the moon, therefore represents the justified dominion of the younger generation of gods and goddesses. The symbols the Sargonid dynasty wanted to make their own, too. The appointed high priestess and royal princess took the name En-Hedu Ana, literally meaning chief priestess of the ornament of heaven. She's the first known writer in world literature, not just the first known female writer. Her poetry was written in Sumerian, the scholarly language, whereas her father's royal inscriptions were in Akkadian. It is also said that Sargon's sister was dedicated to An, the sky father, whereas Sargon himself was devoted to Inanna, having also married a Sumerian lady, most probably a high priestess. Sargon's background is obscure, but we know that he came from Kish, one of the most important city-states of ancient Sumer. His mother, by tradition, is said to be a Sumerian high priestess, and he was brought up by a water thrower, an allusion to a sage dedicated to Enki, the god of magic, sweet waters, and wisdom. Once Sargon's father is unknown, a fact that many place him in the category of having been conceived in the secrecy of the sacred marriage rite. A military victory over Lugal-Zaggesi, the ruler of Kish, gave Sargon dominion over Ur and Uruk, and the brave monarch turned military victory into the foundation of a dynasty. By installing Enheduanna as the high priestess of Ur, Sargon set a precedent combining royal and priestly roles for royal princesses, which was going to last for at least 500 years. After Enheduanna, it became a tradition for the royal princess to become the high priestess of Ur. The choice for this office was politically motivated. The royal princess spoused the prince of the great gods, thus consolidating Sargon's offspring as rulers of Sumer and Akkad and establishing a remarkable pattern linking kingship and kinship to the gods. But Enheduanna proved herself worthy of her father's trust and transcended her secular duties and scribal training to affirm herself in her own right as a poetess and heir of the vision of a united land for Sumer and Akkad. This vision was translated into her compilation of the temple hymns, where the shrines of the land are praised and their gods and goddesses, and the cycle of poems to Inanna, where the goddess is portrayed as the heroic warrior and champion of the land. More importantly, she's the first author in world literature. Her writings go back 2,000 years before Homer and more than 800 years before the Epic of Gilgamesh. Writing approximately around 2300 BCE, Enheduanna's poems are a masterpiece of rhetorical structure, spirituality, political and philosophical statement, sacred testimony, and meta-discourse about the author's creative process. Before Enheduanna, there were scribes, but they did not identify themselves as authors as well in extant cuneiform tablets. She, as poet, changed the act of writing for the mere sake of record-keeping to a loving and reverential holy drama, and perhaps most importantly, the simple enactment and accomplishment of creativity. In the late 14th and early 15th century lived a woman who may be rightly called the patron, and almost even guardian angel, of Joan of Arc. She was not guiltless of scandal and political maneuvering, indeed even participated in darker deeds, but without her there would be no history of Joan the Maid as we know it. Only a power broker this masterful, a descendant of royalty possessed of the requisite administrative, diplomatic, and logistical skills, could have hoped to succeed at so daunting a task as saving Orléans in order to save France. Although her influence over the events of her time was unparalleled, neither her achievements nor her dominance has ever been recognized. Even her name has been largely forgotten. She was Yolande of Aragon, Queen of Sicily, the Dauphin's mother-in-law. Viewed through the prism of Yolande's experiences and perspective, Joan's story abruptly makes sense, like a fragment torn from a page in a book that has been rediscovered and taped back into place. Pry open the Queen's secrets, and there will be found those of Joan of Arc. This is all elucidated in the wonderful book by Nancy Goldstone called The Maid and the Queen, The Secret History of Joan of Arc, from which much of this segment is taken. I highly recommend buying a copy and discovering the full story for yourself. Yolande was born in Barcelona on August 11th, 1381, into the powerful Aragon family. During the reign of the ubiquitously feared monarch, Pedro IV, her grandfather. He died when she was 6 years old, and her father John, upon assuming the throne, marked the occasion by launching a cultural initiative to render the Aragon name famous throughout Europe as the principal center for study of the art of the troubadour, known then as the gay science. There were cultural centers and educational institutions all over, but in the ensuing years here, Yolande matured in an atmosphere the highest learning of all the known arts and sciences, with the particular local addition of incorporating all this into daily living. She loved reading almost more than anything or anyone, and even eventually acquired her own massive library. At the beginning of her life, the kingdom of Sicily encompassed most of Italy south of Rome, and the crown of Aragon controlled much of the Mediterranean. At age 16, after repeatedly rebuking marriage offers, she finally agreed to marry Louis II. She did not want that any more than any other marriage. However, by varying accounts, they seem to have been very deeply in love. Obviously, a rarity in arranged marriages. They owned more castles than they knew what to do with. Yolande gradually found herself ever more frequently in the position of chief negotiator between quarrels and meetings among nobility, very often by happenstance, but equally often by her own personal will, and yet it all solidified a respected reputation for her as being direct and insistent upon integrity among all involved. To help finance her husband's military operations in Naples, she pawned her jewels to the Florentine bankers and managed his estates in Provence and Anjou in his absence. In 1413, she met Isabeau, the Queen of France, and arranged a marriage between her 9-year-old daughter Marie and 10-year-old Charles, son of Isabeau and her husband, known to history as the Mad King Charles VI. This cemented a powerful new political alliance. A threat of war came with the Duke of Burgundy, and coincidence conspired to separate most of the adult males into battle preparations or distant meetings, and Yolande took control of seeing to the safety of the children, including her future son-in-law, Charles, the Dauphin. Violent events kept many apart for so long, and she wound up raising Charles along with her own children. Such events culminated in the Battle of Agincourt. Jean of Burgundy met with the English victor Henry V and arranged to have himself be the next leader of France. Charles came to adore Yolande. In 1417, John suddenly died, and just like that, Charles became the Dauphin and heir to the French throne. Her husband, Louis II, also died. In his will, he enjoined his children to obey their mother in all things and to revere her all their lives. Yolande was made executor of his will and regent over all his fiefs, and she also retained the property associated with her dower, including lands and revenues in Provence. A second invasion from England would soon result in French capitulation and set our queen to task. There was great strife between Burgundians and Armagnacs, and she took it upon herself to reconcile them so as to stand a chance against the English. She approached both and called for a parley, and actually succeeded in gathering representatives from each faction for a meeting. The talks lasted 2 months, and against all odds, a treaty was drawn and another alliance made. When her castle in Angers was threatened in 1423, she, acting as duchess, summoned her vassals and ordered them to present men for battle. Her call was heeded by both nobility and peasantry. She experienced a betrayal from Isabeau, who turned against her in favor of the Burgundians. Military leaders asked her to personally keep charge of organizing and supplying the expanded army. When Joan of Arc was later given her military resources, she asked for and gained notoriety for her intentions to lead the French army against the English by direct instruction from God. Charles initially refused to see her. It was Yolande who urged him to see her and hear her in a private audience, which is what Joan had wanted the whole time. When it was demanded that proof be given that Joan was indeed a virgin, it was also Yolande, along with the women she personally trusted, who oversaw the examination and presented the findings to Charles. In time, she would give everything she owned to finance the coming historical battles which would lead to French liberation. She had a nose for conspiracy and diplomatically snuffed out most attempts, though in several cases that would take long periods of time. When her son, René, was captured and put in prison, she enlisted the aid of his many extended family households, who until then had been long fighting amongst each other, again successfully, also bringing to this effort the most senior church members. Yolande of Aragon deserves far more credit for her role in uniting France against the invading English, ultimately to become one nation from these efforts. Please go out and buy Ms. Goldstone's book to follow the trail yourself, as I don't want to simply outline everything she did coinciding directly with Joan of Arc's career. You will not be disappointed.
We go now to Queen Jinga Mubande, a ruthless and powerful 17th century African ruler of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms, modern-day Angola. Jinga fearlessly and cleverly fought for the freedom and stature of her kingdoms against the Portuguese, who were colonizing the area at the time. Around the turn of the 17th century, the independent kingdoms and states of the Central African coast were threatened by Portuguese attempts to colonize Luanda. Luanda, today the capital of Angola, was founded in 1576. Portugal sought to colonize the region in order to control the trade in African slaves and attacked many of their old trading partners to further this goal. Unlike many other rulers at the time, Jinga was able to adapt to these changing circumstances and fluctuations in power around her. By her own determination and refusal to give in to the Portuguese without a fight, she transformed her kingdom into a formidable commercial state on equal footing with the Portuguese colonies. In 1617, the new governor of Luanda began an aggressive campaign against the kingdom of Ndongo. His troops invaded the capital and forced King Ngola Mbandi, Jinga's brother, to flee from the area. Thousands of Ndongo people were taken prisoner. The king sent his sister Jinga Mbandi to negotiate a peace treaty in 1621, which she did successfully. But Portugal did not honor the terms of the treaty, and King Ngola Mbandi committed suicide, leaving the kingdom to his sister Jinga. As the new sovereign of Ndongo, Jinga re-entered negotiations with the Portuguese. At the time, Ndongo was under attack from both the Portuguese and neighboring African aggressors. Ginga realized that in order to achieve peace and for her kingdom to remain viable, she needed to become an intermediary. She allied Ndongo with Portugal and was baptized as Ana de Souza Ginga Mubande, with the Portuguese colonial governor serving as her godfather. By doing this, she acquired a partner in her fight against her African enemies and ending Portuguese slave raiding in the kingdom. The new alliance didn't last very long, however. Portugal betrayed Ndongo in 1626, and Ginga was forced to flee when war broke out. Ginga took over as ruler of the nearby kingdom of Matamba, capturing Queen Mwango Matamba and routing her army. Ginga then made Matamba her capital, joining it to the kingdom of Ndongo. To build up her kingdom's martial power, Ginga offered sanctuary to runaway slaves and Portuguese-trained African soldiers. She stirred up rebellion among the people still left in Ndongo, now ruled by the Portuguese. She also reached out to the Dutch and invited them to join troops with her. She told the Dutch she would be happy to ally with them because of their justice and politeness, whereas the Portuguese were proud and haughty. Even their combined forces were not enough to drive the Portuguese out, however, and after retreating to Matamba again, Ginga started to focus on developing Matamba as a trading power and the gateway to the Central African interior. By the time of Ginga's death in 1661, at the age of 81, Matamba was on equal footing with the Portuguese colony. The Portuguese came to respect Queen Ginga for her shrewdness and intransigence. With Ginga's rule, Matamba became a powerful kingdom that long resisted Portuguese colonization attempts and was only integrated into Angola in the late 19th century. It doesn't have to have happened a long time ago to be history. Immaculée Ilibagiza is a living example of faith put into action. She was born in Rwanda and studied electronic and mechanical engineering at the National University. Her life was transformed dramatically during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, when on the 7th of April of that year, the president of Rwanda died. All the country's social activity shut down. Voices of the Hutu militia were heard on the radio, giving orders to kill all the cockroaches wherever found. So began the events which, at the end of it all, left almost 1 million Tutsi people slaughtered in just 100 days by the significantly more populous Hutus. They did all this with, more than anything, machetes. 3 out of every 4 of the country's Tutsis were killed. When it began, Immaculee's father told her to run to a minister's house 3 miles away and to beg him to hide her. The minister was a Hutu, a member of the majority tribe that had begun killing the Tutsis. But he had been a friend of the family's. He took her in and hid her, along with 6 other women, in a tiny, rarely used bathroom where she couldn't have imagined what she was in for, even at that moment when the horror was already very real outside. They were well hidden, even from the Hutu pastor's own large family. She and the other women spent 91 days huddled silently together in the cramped bathroom. Just to make sure the gravity of this situation is sinking in, I want to make sure you understand that's 3 months in one small room with 6 other people. Immaculee entered the bathroom a vibrant 115-pound university student with a loving family. She emerged weighing just 65 pounds, that's roughly half her weight from the time this all started, to find that almost all of her family had been brutally murdered. In this experience, she did the only thing she could do, giving it everything she had. She prayed and found her faith. This woman gained a characteristic that I can hardly imagine personally, which is forgiving the people who murdered her family. She is very much a Catholic, and I am very much not. But this is where names of religions and all their traditions just fade into the background, at least as I see it. Think of the psychological effect such a thing would have on almost anyone, how you could let it affect you. Then go look further into her story and see the inner strength this woman found and kept and shared ever since these events. Here's what she said when given the chance to come face to face with one of her family's killers.
I'm like, oh, you know what, it's okay. It's okay, really, I forgive you. Deal with it. It is bigger than me. Just deal with it. I hope you can find hope. And you know, it was a relief that now I know nothing is going to test me more than this.
Immaculée Ilibagiza has since started her own family, marrying happily and having 2 children. She's a thrice published author, writing about her recollections of her experiences, but more importantly, what she gained from them.
There's a time where I felt that he was teaching me about forgiveness and hating. I remember about love. And of course I'm like, oh please, those people, they're evil. You know, that was my first reaction. Don't tell me to love them. And then I was like, you know what, just tell me, how do I do that? The sin is terrible, Immaculée. The sin is terrible. Hate it, and how do you hate it? Is to pray for these people to be delivered from the power of evil.
She speaks all over the world and is the recipient of the 2007 Mahatma Gandhi Reconciliation and Peace Award. She founded a charity organization for orphans of the Rwandan Holocaust, which has since evolved into an educational aid program embracing the entire country.